The throne room stretched for 200 meters in every direction, its walls carved from black crystal that reflected the light of 1,000 suns, conquered by the Zothic Empire, over 3,000 years of dominance across the galaxy. Emperor Krastor sat upon the eternal seat, with his 4 arms folded across his armored chest, while his crimson eyes scanned the assembly of generals and admirals who stood before him in perfect rows. These were the finest military minds his species had ever produced, and today they would hear his greatest command. "The Galactic Council grows weak," Krastor announced, as his voice echoed through the vast chamber, like thunder rolling across mountains. "They hide behind their laws and their borders, while we expand and conquer and bring order to chaos." General Vecnar stepped forward, with his scales gleaming under the throne room lights. He had served the Empire for 60 years, and commanded fleets that had broken the resistance of 12 species. "My Emperor," he began carefully, as his voice carried the weight of experience, "the Council's quarantine borders have stood for thousands of years, and no one questions them lightly." "I question them," Krastor roared as he rose from his throne with such force that several younger officers stepped backward instinctively. "These borders are nothing but fear disguised as wisdom, and superstition masquerading as policy." The Emperor descended the steps from his throne, while his ceremonial cape dragged behind him like a river of darkness. He approached a holographic display that flickered to life at his gesture, and showed a 3-dimensional map of the known galaxy, with its spiral arms glowing in blue and white and gold. Scattered across the map were red zones, each one marked with symbols that predated most modern languages, and each one avoided by every species that valued survival. 43 quarantine zones, Krastor said, as he gestured at the map with one clawed hand. 43 regions of space where the Council forbids travel and contact and exploration. He zoomed the display to focus on one particular red zone, near the outer rim of the galaxy. It was smaller than most others, and contained only a single yellow star, with several orbiting planets. "This one interests me most," the Emperor continued, as his eyes narrowed with predatory focus. "A single system, quarantined for 500 years, and the Council refuses to explain why, beyond citing historical precedent and extreme danger." Admiral Thexris cleared her throat. She was the oldest member of the War Council, and her scales had faded to gray with age. "My Emperor, if I may speak plainly," she asked. Krastor waved a hand in permission. "The Council established those borders for reasons we may not fully understand," Thexris said carefully, as she chose each word with precision. 23 expeditions have entered various quarantine zones over the past 50,000 years, according to the historical records, and not one has returned. "Coincidence," Krastor dismissed with a sneer, "or fabrication meant to keep lesser species in their place while hiding valuable resources and technology." "The species that vanished were not lesser," Thexris countered with unusual boldness. "The Veshkai Empire controlled a quarter of the galaxy before they entered a quarantine zone 75,000 years ago and disappeared within a single planetary rotation." The throne room fell silent, except for the hum of the holographic display. Even Krastor paused at the mention of the Veshkai. Their ruins still dotted hundreds of worlds, and their technology remained partially undecipherable, even after millennia of study. "The Veshkai grew overconfident," Krastor finally said as he dismissed the concern with a gesture. "We will not make their mistakes, because we are stronger and smarter and better prepared." He turned to face his assembled military leadership with fire burning in his eyes. "I am assembling the 7th Fleet for immediate deployment. 10,000 warships, crewed by our finest warriors, and equipped with weapons that can shatter planets." Gasps rippled through the assembled officers. The 7th Fleet represented nearly a third of the Empire's total military strength, and had never been fully deployed in living memory. "We will cross the border of this system," Krasdor declared as he pointed at the red zone on the display. "We will discover what the Council fears so greatly, and we will claim it for the glory of the Zothic Empire." "My Emperor," General Vecnar began, but Krasdor cut him off with a sharp gesture. "The decision is made," the Emperor thundered. "Any officer who lacks the courage for this mission may resign their commission now and retire to the farming colonies in shame." No one moved. To resign would mean social death for them and their families. The Zothic culture valued martial honor above all else. 3 days later, Ambassador Yelshara of the Galactic Council arrived at the Imperial Palace, requesting an emergency audience. She was a member of the Takarai species, tall and thin with skin that shimmered like oil on water, and 3 eyes that could see into the ultraviolet spectrum. Krasdor received her in a smaller chamber reserved for diplomatic meetings, though he made no effort to hide his contempt for the Council's bureaucracy. "Emperor Krasdor," Yelshara began, as she bowed according to Jatik custom, "the Council has learned of your planned expedition into Quarantine Zone 41, and we strongly urge you to reconsider." "The Council does not command the Jatik Empire," Krasdor replied coldly. "We do not seek to command," Yelshara said as she straightened and met his gaze, despite the obvious danger in doing so. "We seek to warn because we have seen this pattern before, and it always ends the same way." She produced a data crystal from her diplomatic pouch and activated it. Holographic images appeared, showing ancient documents covered in languages both living and dead, all of them marked with the same warning symbols that surrounded the quarantine zones. "These are the final transmissions from 23 expeditions," Yelshara explained as her voice carried genuine fear. 23 different species across 50,000 years, and all of them entered quarantine zones, and all of them vanished. "Then we will be the first to return," Krasdor said dismissively. Yelshara's 3 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep distress among her people. "The records from the oldest archives suggest that the beings within Zone 41 placed the quarantine on themselves," she said quietly. "They isolated their own world to protect others from what they could do." "Protect others?" Krasdor laughed. "Or hide in fear from true warriors?" "The last transmission from that world came 75,000 years ago," Yelshara continued. She pulled up another document. It was broadcast in every known language of that era, and simply said, "We will remain here for your safety and our own. Never force us to defend ourselves again." "Words from cowards," Krasdor declared. "The 7th Fleet launches in 2 days, and nothing you say will change that." Yelshara bowed again, deeper this time, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of sorrow rather than anger. "Then may your gods have mercy on you, Emperor, because the beings in that system will not." 2 days later, the 7th Fleet assembled at the edge of Jothic space, 10,000 warships arranged in perfect formation, with the Emperor's flagship at the center, like a dagger pointed at the heart of the unknown. Krasdor stood on the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by screens showing tactical data and status reports from every ship in the fleet. His 4 arms gripped the command rail as anticipation coursed through his body. "All ships report ready," Admiral Thexris announced from her station, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Then we proceed," Krasdor commanded. "Set course for Quarantine Zone 41, maximum speed." The fleet surged forward as their faster-than-light drives engaged simultaneously. 10,000 ships vanished from Jothic space and reappeared at the border of the Forbidden Zone 3 hours later. Before them hung the boundary markers, ancient satellites broadcasting warnings in 700 languages, while bathing space in red light that pulsed like a heartbeat. "Cross the border," Krasdor ordered. The fleet moved forward, 10,000 ships passing through the warning perimeter as alarms blared, and automated messages screamed caution in every language, and then they were inside. All systems normal, the tactical officer reported. No hostile contacts and no unusual readings. Krasthor smiled as triumph filled his chest. The Council's warnings had been nothing but empty fear. Continue toward the third planet, he commanded. Prepare first contact protocols. The Seventh Fleet advanced deeper into the system, while Earth grew larger on their screens. A blue and white sphere that looked peaceful and inviting, and utterly unremarkable. Then, 72 hours after crossing the border, every single ship in the Seventh Fleet went silent. 3 weeks of silence had passed since the Seventh Fleet crossed into Quarantine Zone 41, and the Galactic Council chambers buzzed with tension as representatives from 47 species debated their response to the crisis. Ambassador Yel Shara stood at the central podium, with her 3 eyes scanning the assembled delegates, while her hands trembled slightly. She had warned Emperor Krasthor, and he had ignored her, and now an entire fleet had vanished without a trace. "We must send a rescue expedition," declared Ambassador Korvax of the Manthar Collective, as his mandibles clicked with agitation. 10,000 ships and their crews cannot simply disappear. Every rescue expedition sent into quarantine zones has also vanished, countered Representative Shamara of the Wise Ones, as her crystalline form pulsed with orange light. We risk compounding the tragedy. The debate continued for hours, until finally a compromise emerged. They would send a small research team into the zone, carefully chosen and heavily supported, with one clear goal: to gather intelligence and determine what had really happened to the vanished fleet. Fleet of 30 ships, crewed by volunteers and equipped with every sensor and communication device known to galactic science. They would approach cautiously and retreat at the first sign of danger. Commander Velthas of the Alliance Navy volunteered to lead the expedition. He was a member of the Kryn species, beings who lived for 300 years and possessed natural resistance to most forms of radiation and toxins. And he had spent his entire career studying quarantine zones from a safe distance. "I want full spectrum scanning every millisecond," Velthas ordered as his fleet assembled at the border 3 days later. "If a single molecule moves in an unusual pattern, I want to know about it immediately." His science officer, a young Takari named Meshala with brilliant purple skin, nodded as her fingers danced across her console. "All sensors calibrated and recording, Commander," she reported. The 30 ships crossed the border together while their shields raised and weapons charged. Every crew member felt their hearts racing as they passed the ancient warning satellites that still broadcast their messages into the void. "No immediate hostile response," Meshala announced after several tense minutes. "Radiation levels normal, and no energy signatures detected ahead." They proceeded cautiously toward the inner system, while their sensors swept space for any sign of the Jothic fleet. Hours passed in careful silence, until the tactical officer suddenly straightened in her seat. "Contact," she called out. "Single large vessel bearing 27 Mark V, at a distance of 400,000 kilometers. "On screen," Velthas ordered. The view screen flickered to life, showing a massive Jothic battlecruiser drifting in space, with its running lights dark and its hull intact. There was no visible damage and no signs of battle, but the ship made no response to their hails. "Life signs?" Velthas asked quietly. Meshala worked her console for several moments before looking up with confusion written across her face. "None, Commander," she said. "The ship is completely empty." "That's impossible," the tactical officer objected. "A battle cruiser that size has a crew of 1,200. "Nevertheless, the sensors show 0 biological signatures," Meshala insisted. "No heat signatures from living bodies, and no movement anywhere on that ship." Velthas felt cold dread settle into his chest, but he maintained his composure. "Bring us alongside and prepare a boarding team," he ordered. "I want hazard suits and armed escorts." 6 members of the expedition's crew crossed to the abandoned battlecruiser through an umbilical tunnel. They wore full environmental suits with independent life support and carried weapons that could stop most known hostile life forms. The airlock opened without resistance, revealing corridors that still had power and gravity. The lights were functioning, and the air was breathable, but the ship felt wrong in ways that defied easy description. "It's like they all just stood up and left during their shift," reported Lieutenant Keshvar as her team explored deeper into the vessel. Meals half-eaten on tables, and workstations still displaying active duty logs. "Check the bridge," Velthas ordered from his command ship. "Find out what happened." The boarding team made their way to the battlecruiser's command center, where they found more of the same eerie normalcy. Everything functioned perfectly, but every living being was gone. Meshala accessed the ship's computer and began downloading the captain's logs, while her hands shook inside her suit gloves. "Entries now," she said over the communication channel. According to the logs, the battlecruiser had operated normally for 14 hours after crossing the quarantine border. The crew had detected nothing unusual, and scans of the third planet showed a primitive civilization with basic technology and no apparent military threat. Then, at the 14-hour mark, every single crew member had calmly walked to the nearest airlock. "They opened the airlocks voluntarily?" Velthas asked in disbelief. "Yes, Commander," Meshala confirmed, as she read through the data with growing horror. The logs show that all personnel methodically made their way to airlocks throughout the ship and cycled them simultaneously. No panic, and no struggle, and no attempt to stop each other. "What about their personal logs?" Velthas pressed. "Did anyone explain why?" Meshala pulled up the final personal log entry from the battlecruiser's captain. It was a video recording that showed a Zothic officer sitting calmly at his desk with his forearms folded. "I understand now why the Council fears this place," the captain said in the recording, with his voice utterly serene. "We came here with weapons and aggression, but they showed us something instead of fighting us. They showed us every consequence of every violent act we have ever committed and will ever commit." The captain paused as tears streamed down his scaled face. "They made us feel what our victims felt, and understand what our violence truly costs," he continued. "Not through pain or punishment, but through perfect empathy. We felt everything." Another pause as the captain looked directly at the camera. "I cannot carry this weight and continue living," he said simply. "None of us can. We choose to leave our ships and our weapons and our empire behind because we finally understand what we have been." The recording ended. Velthas sat in his command chair feeling numb as the implications crashed over him like waves. "Find more ships," he ordered quietly. "I need to know if this happened to the entire fleet." Over the next 4 days, the rescue expedition located hundreds of abandoned Shatik vessels drifting throughout the system. Every single one told the same story of crews who had calmly evacuated their ships after approximately 14 hours inside the quarantine zone. They found fighters and frigates and destroyers and carriers, all intact and all empty, until finally they located the Imperial flagship near the orbit of the fourth planet. Emperor Krasthor's personal logs were still accessible in his private quarters. Meshala retrieved them with shaking hands and played the final entry for Commander Velthas. The Emperor appeared on screen looking utterly broken. His crimson eyes had lost their fire, and his forearms hung limp at his sides. "I ordered this expedition out of pride and arrogance," Krasthor said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I believe the Jothic Empire stood above all others, and that our might gave us the right to go where we pleased." He looked directly at the camera with an expression of profound shame. "The beings of this world did not attack us," he continued. "They did something far more devastating. They connected us to every life we have taken, and every world we have conquered, and every species we have enslaved." Tears fell from the Emperor's eyes, a sight none of his subjects had ever witnessed. "For 3 hours, I felt the death of every being killed by my orders," he said. I felt their fear and their pain and their final thoughts. Their families, and the loss of their potential, and the ripples of suffering spreading across time. Krasthor stood from his desk and walked toward the camera. I am leaving this ship because I cannot live with what I have been, he stated. I am leaving my empire because it does not deserve to exist. I am leaving everything because the weight of my actions is too great to bear. He reached toward the controls and the recording ended. Commander Vel'Thos ordered his fleet to retreat immediately. They had found what remained of the 7th Fleet, but they had also discovered something far more terrifying than weapons or violence. What happened to the crews? Meshala asked as they crossed back over the quarantine border. Are they dead? I don't know, Vel'Thos admitted, but I know we cannot go any closer to that planet. Whatever lives there has the power to make you understand yourself completely, and that might be the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy. Rescue Expedition returned to Council Space with their recordings and reports. They brought evidence of 10,000 abandoned ships and 0 survivors, and one inescapable conclusion. Whatever protected Quarantine Zone 41 did not need weapons to defend itself. The Galactic Council's archives stretched deep beneath the surface of Sanctuary Station, a massive structure that orbited a neutron star and served as the repository for 50,000 years of accumulated knowledge from hundreds of species. Archivist Prime Thelnara was older than most civilizations. She belonged to the Memory Keepers, a species that lived for millennia and possessed the ability to store information in their crystalline neural structures with perfect fidelity. She descended through level after level of the archives as her form glowed with soft blue light in the darkness. Beside her walked Ambassador Yel-Shara and Commander Vel'Thos, both of them desperate for answers about what had destroyed the Jothic 7th Fleet. The oldest records are kept in the Forbidden Vaults, Thelnara explained, as they reached a massive door sealed with technology from civilizations that had long since transcended physical existence. Very few are permitted access, because some knowledge carries inherent danger. We need to understand what happened, Yel-Shara insisted. The Council must know what we're dealing with. Thelnara placed her crystalline hand against the door, and it recognized her genetic signature. Ancient mechanisms groaned to life as the seal broke, and the door swung inward, revealing a chamber filled with data crystals that pulsed with their own internal light. Quarantine Zone 41 is the oldest restricted area in galactic history, Thelnara began, as she moved through the vault, selecting specific crystals with practiced precision. It was established 75,000 years ago by unanimous vote of the Council's predecessors. She activated the first crystal, and holographic images filled the chamber. They showed Earth as it had been in prehistoric times, when massive ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere, and early humans had only recently developed basic tools. At that time, Earth was home to a species called humanity, Thelnara continued. They numbered approximately 40 billion individuals spread across all the continents, and they had just achieved faster-than-light travel. 40 billion? Vel'Thos interrupted in surprise. Current population readings from our scans showed only 7 billion. Yes, Thelnara confirmed grimly. The population declined significantly after what happened, but I'm getting ahead of the historical record. She activated another crystal, showing images of human starships. They were elegant vessels with sweeping curves and gleaming hulls that reflected the aesthetic preferences of their creators. Humanity entered the galactic community peacefully, Thelnara explained. They established trade relations with 17 species and shared their scientific discoveries and artistic achievements. They were curious and generous and welcomed contact with other civilizations. The holographic display shifted to show a different species, massive reptilian beings with thick armored plates and weapons integrated into their biological structure. This was the Veshkai Empire, Thelnara said, as her voice took on a darker tone. They controlled a quarter of the known galaxy. Through military conquest and slavery, they believed that might gave them the right to dominate all other species. Yelshara felt her skin shimmer with distress. She had studied the Veshkai ruins and always wondered what had caused such a powerful civilization to collapse so completely. The Veshkai encountered humanity and saw only weakness. Felnara continued. Humans were physically fragile compared to most spacefaring species, and their weapons technology was centuries behind galactic standards. The display showed Veshkai warships attacking a human colony on a distant world. The images were difficult to watch, as cities burned and civilians fled in panic. The Veshkai attacked without provocation or warning, Selnara explained. They destroyed 3 human colonies and enslaved the survivors. They demanded that Earth surrender and submit to Veshkai rule. How did humanity respond? Vel'Thas asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. They tried diplomacy first, Felnara said, as she activated another crystal. Human ambassadors pleaded with the Veshkai to stop the violence and offered reparations for any perceived offenses. But the Veshkai interpreted this as confirmation of human weakness. The holographic display showed a massive Veshkai fleet assembling around Earth's solar system, thousands of warships preparing for an overwhelming assault. The Veshkai sent their greatest armada to conquer Earth itself, Felnara continued. They broadcasted their intentions across all frequencies so that every species in the system would know. Galaxy would witness human submission and understand Veshkai's supremacy. She paused to activate several crystals simultaneously, and the chamber filled with images from multiple perspectives. What happened next had been recorded by observerships from a dozen neutral species who had come to witness the expected human defeat. As the Veshkai fleet entered Earth's solar system, something unprecedented occurred, Felnara said quietly. Every human being on Earth and all the colonies simultaneously entered a meditative state. The images showed billions of humans stopping whatever they were doing and sitting or standing in stillness with their eyes closed. Children in schools and workers in factories and soldiers in military bases, all of them connected to something invisible. What you're seeing is the activation of what humans called the silence, Felnara explained. It was a coordinated psychic phenomenon that used Earth's entire population as a neural network. Psychic abilities? Vel'Thas asked, skeptically. Most species have latent psionic potential, but nothing on this scale. Humanity was different, Felnara said. Their brains had evolved with unusual capacity for empathy and mirror neurons that allowed them to deeply understand the mental and emotional states of others. When they connected those abilities across billions of minds, they created something unprecedented. The holographic display shifted to show what happened aboard the Veshkai warships. The massive reptilian warriors suddenly stopped moving, and their weapons fell silent. The silence did not attack in any conventional sense, Felnara continued. Instead, it created a psychic field that connected every Veshkai individual to the suffering they had caused. Each warrior felt every death they had inflicted, and every moment of pain and every loss experienced by their victims. Yelshara watched in horrified fascination as the Veshkai crews abandoned their ships. They moved calmly and deliberately toward airlocks and weapon ports and exhaust vents, anywhere that would expose them to vacuum. It happened across the entire empire simultaneously, Felnara explained, as tears formed in her crystalline eyes. 200 billion Veshkai on 1,000 worlds all experienced the same revelation at the same moment. They felt the weight of their empire's cruelty and violence, and they chose to end their participation in it. They committed mass suicide? Vel'Thas asked in shock. They chose non-existence over continuing to be what they had been, Felnara corrected gently. The silence gave them perfect understanding of their actions and their consequences. It made violence psychologically impossible for anyone within its influence. The holographic display went dark for a moment, before showing a final transmission from Earth. A human spokesperson stood before the camera, with tears streaming down her face. "We did not want this," the human said. "We created the silence only as a last resort to defend our world, but we cannot undo what has happened. The Veshkai made their choice when they understood what they had been." The spokesperson looked directly at the camera with profound sorrow. "We are horrified by our own capability," she continued. "We built a weapon that removes the desire to fight, and we used it to defend ourselves. But in doing so, we showed the galaxy something terrible about what humans can do." A long pause followed before the spokesperson spoke again. "Therefore, we are voluntarily withdrawing from galactic civilization," she announced. "We will return to Earth and remain isolated until we are certain we can interact with others without posing this danger." The transmission ended with coordinates for the quarantine border and a simple warning: "Never force us to defend ourselves again." Felnara deactivated the crystals, and the chamber fell into darkness except for her own bioluminescent glow. 23 expeditions have entered that quarantine zone over 75,000 years, she said quietly. Every single one encountered the same response. They were shown the truth of their own violence and given the choice to continue or stop. And they all chose to stop, Yelshara finished. "Yes," Felnara confirmed, "because once you truly understand the cost of violence, once you feel it the way your victims felt it, continuing becomes impossible." Velfast stood in silence, absorbing the implications. "The Zothic crews we found," he said slowly, "they felt everything?" "Everything," Felnara confirmed. 3,000 years of imperial conquest and slavery and war. All of it experienced as their victims experienced it in the span of a few hours. "No wonder they walked into space," Yelshara whispered. "The question now," Felnara said, as she began returning the crystals to their places, "is whether humanity will remain isolated forever, or whether they might someday choose to rejoin us. After what they can do," Velthas asked, "would that even be safe?" "Perhaps the better question," Felnara replied, "is whether we are safe from ourselves without them." Dr. Sarah Chen woke from the dream at exactly 3:47 in the morning, with her heart racing and sweat soaking through her sheets. She had dreamed of ships approaching Earth and a feeling of ancient machinery stirring to life after millennia of sleep. She sat up in her apartment in San Francisco and looked out at the city lights, while trying to shake the unsettling sensation that something fundamental had shifted in the world around her. Sarah was a neuroscientist who specialized in studying collective consciousness and emergent behaviors in large populations. For the past 5 years, she had been researching how human brains synchronized during group activities like concerts and protests and religious ceremonies. What she didn't know was that her career choice had never been random. Something in her genetic code had guided her toward understanding the very thing she was about to become part of. Across the planet, 7 billion people experienced variations of the same dream that night. Most dismissed it as a strange coincidence or the result of solar activity affecting sleep patterns, but approximately 200,000 individuals felt something more. These people, scattered across every continent and every culture, found themselves inexplicably drawn towards specific locations. They couldn't explain the compulsion, but they knew with absolute certainty where they needed to go. Sarah felt it too, a pull toward the mountains east of the city that grew stronger with each passing hour. She tried to ignore it and go to work, but by noon she had abandoned her research and was driving toward the Sierra Nevada without any rational explanation for her actions. She wasn't alone on the highway. Dozens of other vehicles traveled in the same direction, and when she glanced at the other drivers, she saw the same confused determination on their faces. By evening, she had reached a remote valley where hundreds of people were already gathering. They came from all walks of life: teachers and engineers and artists and farmers, united only by the inexplicable certainty that they belonged in this place. "I don't understand what's happening," said a young man standing near Sarah as darkness fell. His name was Marcus, and he had left his job at a tech company in Los Angeles without explanation. "Neither do I," Sarah admitted, "but I couldn't stay away." As night deepened, the gathered people began to feel connections forming between them. Subtle at first, like whispers at the edge of hearing, then stronger as their minds began to resonate with each other. Sarah felt her scientific training struggling against the experience, even as part of her recognized it as the phenomenon she had spent years studying. Except now, she was inside it rather than observing from outside. "We're synchronizing," she said aloud, as understanding dawned. "Our neural patterns are aligning." An older woman approached. She had silver hair and kind eyes, and introduced herself as Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who had been researching human genetic anomalies for 4 decades. "I think I know what we are," Elizabeth said quietly. "I found references in my family's historical documents to ancestors who called themselves listeners." "Listeners?" Sarah asked. "People who can hear the collective consciousness of humanity when it activates," Elizabeth explained. "My great-great-grandmother wrote about them in journals from the 1940s. She claimed that certain bloodlines carried genetic markers that allowed them to interface with what she called the network." More people gathered around as Elizabeth spoke, and several others confirmed that their families also had stories about ancestors with unusual abilities, mostly dismissed as superstition or mental illness by modern relatives. "The network," Sarah repeated as pieces fell into place. "That's what I've been studying without realizing it, the way human brains can function as distributed nodes in a larger system." "Exactly," Elizabeth confirmed, "and I think we're nodes that can consciously access the system, while others connect unconsciously." Deep beneath Antarctica, in a facility that appeared on no government maps and predated recorded human civilization, ancient machinery hummed to life after 75,000 years of dormancy. The facility had been built by humanity's distant ancestors, the generation that had created the silence, and then voluntarily isolated Earth to protect the galaxy from their own power. Automated systems detected the Jatak fleet's violation of the quarantine border, and initiated pre-programmed responses. Genetic markers dormant in human DNA began expressing themselves, and those who carried the activated sequences felt the irresistible call to gather. In the valley, Sarah and the other listeners felt the connection strengthen until they could sense each other's thoughts and emotions with perfect clarity. It wasn't intrusive or uncomfortable, but rather like remembering something they had always known. "We're fragments," Sarah said, as understanding flooded through her. "Humanity is normally fragmented into individual consciousnesses for safety, but when threatened, we can reconnect into a gestalt." "A hive mind?" Marcus asked with concern. "No," Elizabeth corrected. "A collective consciousness where individuals remain distinct, but can share resources and coordinate perfectly, like neurons in a single brain, rather than insects in a hive." Through their connection, the listeners began accessing ancient memories encoded in their genes. They saw images of Earth 75,000 years ago, when 40 billion humans had walked the planet and the network had been permanently active. They saw the Golden Age, when humanity had traveled the stars peacefully and shared their discoveries with other species. They saw the joy of first contact and the wonder of discovering that life existed in countless forms throughout the universe. Then they saw the Veshkai attack and felt the ancient fear and anger that had led humanity to create their ultimate defense. The silence that had reached across light years and touched every member of an empire with perfect empathy. "We didn't kill them," Sarah whispered as the true history became clear. "We showed them what they had done, and they chose to leave. But it destroyed them as surely as any weapon," Elizabeth added, "and humanity was horrified by their own capability." The memories continued flowing, They saw the decision to fragment the network and reduce Earth's population through voluntary migration to colony worlds that would be abandoned and forgotten. They saw the construction of the quarantine borders and the final transmission warning the galaxy to leave humanity alone. "We did this to ourselves," Marcus said with awe. "We chose isolation to protect others. And now someone has forced us to activate again," Sarah concluded. Through their connection, the listeners could feel the echo of what had happened to the Zothic crews. They felt the moment when the silence had touched those 10,000 ships and shown each warrior the full weight of their empire's cruelty. "They're not dead," Elizabeth said with certainty. "They're alive somewhere, but they chose to leave their weapons and their violence behind." "The network released them after they understood," Sarah added. "It always releases people once they see clearly." As dawn broke over the valley, the listeners felt the network beginning to deactivate, its defensive purpose fulfilled, and the threat neutralized. "We'll fragment again," Marcus said with a note of sadness. "We'll forget this connection and return to being individuals." "Not entirely," Sarah corrected as she felt knowledge settling into her mind that would remain even after the deep connection faded. "We'll remember enough to understand what we are and what we can do. And to choose not to do it unless absolutely necessary," Elizabeth finished. Throughout the valley, 200,000 listeners stood together in the morning light, while the last remnants of the ancient network pulsed through them. They were humanity's failsafe and guardian and warning, proof that even the gentlest species could become dangerous when threatened. But they were also proof that humanity had chosen compassion over conquest. They had built a weapon that removed the desire for violence rather than inflicting death. And then they had locked that weapon away and hidden themselves to avoid ever using it. Again. Pray. Sarah looked around at the other listeners and saw the same mixture of pride and sorrow on every face. They understood now what their ancestors had done and why the galaxy feared and respected the quarantine borders. "We should contact the Galactic Council," Sarah said. "They need to know that we're not hostile and that what happened to the Zothic fleet was defensive, not aggressive." "Will they believe us?" Marcus asked. "They'll have to," Elizabeth replied, "because the alternative is living in fear of us forever, and neither they nor we deserve that." The listeners began leaving the valley in small groups, returning to their normal lives but carrying the knowledge of what they were and what humanity could do if pushed too far. Sarah drove back to San Francisco with her mind full of questions about what came next. Would humanity remain isolated forever, or would they find a way to rejoin the galactic community without posing a threat? Have answers yet, but she knew that the choice belonged to all of humanity, not just the listeners, but every person on Earth who contributed unconsciously to the network when it activated. As she reached the city, she looked up at the stars and wondered if somewhere out there the Zothic survivors were looking back at Earth with understanding rather than hatred. She hoped they were. 6 months after the 7th Fleet's disappearance, a diplomatic vessel approached the quarantine border around Earth's solar system. It moved slowly and broadcast peaceful intentions on every frequency, while maintaining a respectful distance from the boundary markers. Ambassador Yelshara stood on the bridge, with her 3 eyes fixed on the view screen, showing that blue-green planet that had haunted galactic nightmares for 75,000 years. Beside her stood Archivist Prime Felnara. Those crystalline form pulsed with nervous energy. "Are we certain this is wise?" asked Captain Renthal as his scaled hands gripped the helm controls. 23 expeditions entered that zone, and none returned. "We're not entering," Yelshara reminded him. "We're requesting permission to communicate. That's very different from forcing our way inside." They had debated this approach for months in the council chambers. Some species wanted to reinforce the quarantine and forget that Earth existed, while others argued that ignoring the situation would only guarantee future violations. Yelshara had proposed a third option: acknowledge what had happened and attempt peaceful contact with humanity's permission. "Transmitting first contact package now," announced the communications officer, sending greetings in 700 languages and requesting dialogue. Hours passed in tense silence while the diplomatic vessel maintained its position just outside the border. The crew watched their sensors carefully for any sign of response. Then finally a message arrived, audio only and in perfect galactic standard. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen, speaking on behalf of Earth's Listener Council. We have been expecting you, Ambassador Yelshara." Yelshara felt her skin shimmer with surprise. "You know who I am?" "We know you tried to warn the Zatik Emperor," Sarah replied. "We know you've spent your career advocating for peaceful coexistence and respecting boundaries. That's why we're willing to speak with you. May I ask how you know these things?" Yelshara asked carefully. "When the network activates, we can sense intentions and histories," Sarah explained. "We felt your genuine concern when you came to warn Krasthor. We also felt his arrogance and refusal to listen." "The network?" Thelnara interjected. "Is that what you call the silence?" "The silence is what others named it," Sarah corrected gently, "because it connects us rather than silencing anyone. It's a tool for understanding, not a weapon for destroying." Yelshara exchanged glances with Thelnara before speaking again. "Dr. Chen, the Galactic Council would like to formally apologize for the Zatok Empire's violation of your borders, and discuss how we can prevent similar incidents in the future." "We appreciate that," Sarah said. "But we also recognize that the quarantine has become a source of fear and speculation. Perhaps it's time we explained ourselves properly." "You would be willing to meet?" Yelshara asked hopefully. "On neutral ground," Sarah confirmed. "We propose a location exactly at the border. Your ship can remain on your side, while our delegation approaches from ours." 3 days later, a small shuttle departed from Earth, carrying 5 human representatives: Dr. Sarah Chen and Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, along with 3 others chosen to represent humanity's diversity: a young engineer from Lagos, elderly teacher from Beijing, and a farmer from rural Argentina. They wore simple clothing and carried no weapons as their shuttle crossed the vast distance to the quarantine border, where the Council's diplomatic vessel waited. When the 2 ships came within visual range, Yelshara studied the humans through her view screen with fascination. They looked remarkably fragile, with their soft skin and small frames. Nothing about their physical appearance suggested the power they possessed. "They don't look dangerous," Captain Renthal muttered. "The most dangerous beings rarely do," Thelnara replied quietly. The 2 delegations met in the space between their vessels. Both groups wore spacesuits and communicated through short-range radio, a symbolic meeting ground that violated no borders. "Ambassador Yelshara," Sarah greeted with a slight bow, "thank you for respecting our boundaries and requesting permission, rather than demanding entry." "Dr. Chen," Yelshara replied, returning the bow. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us. The Council has many questions." "As do we," Sarah said. "But perhaps we should start with what matters most, the fate of the Zatik crews." Yelshara felt her skin pulse with concern. "Are they alive?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "They're living peacefully on various uninhabited worlds within our solar system. Mars has a small colony, and several moons of Jupiter house others." "They chose to stay?" Yelshara asked in surprise. "They chose not to return to lives built on violence," Elizabeth Morrison clarified. "The network showed them what they had been, and they decided to become something different." "Can we speak with them?" Thelnara requested. "Eventually," Sarah said, "but they need time to heal from what they experienced. Understanding the full weight of your actions all at once is traumatic, even when necessary." Yelshara nodded slowly. "What happened to Emperor Krasthor?" "He's on Mars, leading a settlement focused on reconciliation and restoration, Sarah replied. He spends his days growing food and teaching children about the costs of empire. He says it's the least he can do to balance the harm he caused. The revelation hung in the space between them. The mighty emperor who had commanded 10,000 ships now worked as a farmer and teacher. Your weapon is terrible, Yelshara said quietly, not because it kills, but because it transforms. It's not a weapon, Sarah insisted. It's a mirror. We simply show beings what they already are, and what they've already done. They'd choose what to do with that knowledge. But you could activate it against anyone, Captain Renthal interjected over the radio. You could transform entire civilizations against their will. We could, Sarah admitted. That's why we isolated ourselves 75,000 years ago. We were horrified by our own capability, and chose to remove ourselves from galactic affairs, rather than risk becoming what we feared. Why are you talking to us now? Yelshara asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment before answering. Because isolation isn't sustainable forever, and because the galaxy deserves to understand what we are, rather than just fear what we can do. Elizabeth stepped forward. We want to propose a new arrangement, she said. The quarantine remains but becomes voluntary rather than enforced. Earth chooses to stay isolated, but maintains communication channels with the Council. You would rejoin the galactic community? Felnara asked hopefully. Not yet, Sarah clarified. Perhaps not for generations, but we'd like to begin cultural exchanges and educational programs, ways to interact that don't require us to leave our solar system or others to enter it. Yelshara considered the proposal carefully. What would these exchanges look like? We could share art and music and literature. Transmissions, the young engineer from Lagos suggested. Humans could learn about galactic cultures, and you could learn about us, without anyone crossing borders. We could establish joint research programs, the teacher from Beijing added. Scientists working together across the distance to solve problems that benefit everyone. We could teach each other about different approaches to living, the Argentine farmer concluded. Humans have spent 75,000 years thinking about violence and peace. Maybe our perspective would be valuable. Yelshara felt hope rising in her chest. I believe the Council would accept such an arrangement, she said. But there's one more matter we must address. What prevents future violations of the border? We'll help with that, Sarah offered. We can provide clear documentation about what happens to those who cross uninvited. Not threats, but honest explanations. Most species will choose not to risk transformation once they understand it. And those who still choose to cross, Yelshara pressed. The network will respond defensively as it always has, Sarah said simply. We won't apologize for protecting ourselves, but we also won't hunt or pursue anyone who respects our boundaries. Over the following hours, the two delegations negotiated the framework for Earth's new relationship with the galactic community. Voluntary isolation with open communication channels. The borders would remain, but both sides would understand they represented choice rather than imprisonment. When the meeting concluded, Sarah floated back toward her shuttle, but paused to look at Yelshara one final time. Ambassador, she called. Tell the Council something for us. Of course, Yelshara replied. Tell them that humanity doesn't want to be feared, Sarah said. We want to be understood. We're not monsters or weapons or threats. We're beings who made a terrible choice to defend ourselves, and then chose to live with the consequences. I will tell them, Yelshara promised. As both delegations returned to their respective ships, Yelshara watched Earth growing smaller on her view screen, and felt that perhaps this marked the beginning of something important. Not first contact exactly, but rather honest contact. Back on Earth, Sarah stood in her apartment looking up at the stars, while news of the meeting spread across the planet. Some humans wanted to end isolation immediately, while others argued for maintaining it indefinitely. But most simply felt relief that the galaxy finally understood them. She thought about the Jothic survivors living on Mars and Jupiter's moons. Former warriors learning to farm and build and create instead of conquer. And she hoped their transformation would serve as a testament to what the network truly did. It didn't destroy, it revealed. It didn't punish, it educated. It didn't conquer, it mirrored. And humanity, having built such a thing, had chosen to lock it away rather than wield it as others might have. That choice, Sarah believed, said more about humanity than any weapon ever could.